Admiral Richard Halsey chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound that echoed through the Joint Operations Center. "So, what's your call sign, Sniper?" "The Den Mother," he mocked, eyes sweeping the brass. Chief Jennings didn't blink. "They call me Night Fox, sir." Within 48 hours, that name would haunt him. The sand at Coronado does not care about your gender, your background, or your politics. It only cares about how much suffering you can endure before your mind breaks. For Chief Petty Officer Anna Jennings, the cold, relentless surf of the Pacific Ocean was just another variable to calculate. Anna was not an experiment, though the brass in Washington treated her like one. She was the first female candidate to quietly pass through the newly integrated Bud S Class 352 and the first to be subsequently drafted into the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DEVGRU, commonly known as SEAL Team 6. Her presence was a closely guarded secret, a classified anomaly kept off the public ledger to avoid media circuses. But within the hyper-masculine, insular world of Tier 1 operators, she was an unwelcome disruption. She didn't look like a recruitment poster. Standing at 5'9", she was lean, corded with the kind of dense, functional muscle built from years as a collegiate biathlete and a backcountry hunting guide in Montana. Her face was severely angular, usually smeared with camouflage grease, and her eyes held the detached, terrifying calm of a top-tier predator. They didn't call her Night Fox because she was cunning or sly in the traditional sense. She earned the moniker during her final sniper qualification in the grueling mountains of Kodiak, Alaska. During a simulated high-value target stalk, her instructor, Master Chief David Miller, a man who had spent 20 years hunting insurgents across the Middle East, was tasked with finding her using state-of-the-art thermal imaging and ground radar. For 48 hours, the biometric sensors picked up nothing. The command center assumed she had succumbed to hypothermia and washed out. When Miller finally called an end to the exercise, frustrated and ready to dispatch a search and rescue bird, a patch of snow 70 yards to his left suddenly shifted. Jennings rose from the freezing mud, her ghillie suit dripping with ice, her Macmillan TAC-338 rifle leveled directly at Miller's chest plate. She had packed her suit with freezing mud and snow to mask her thermal signature, slowing her heart rate and breathing to near hibernation levels. She had been watching him drink his coffee for 6 hours. "Jesus Christ," Miller had whispered, lowering his binoculars. "You're like a damn fox in the night." The name stuck. But a call sign doesn't buy you respect in the squadron room. Blood and sweat do. When Anna was assigned to Red Squadron under the command of Lieutenant Commander Eric Stone, the reception was frosty at best. Stone was a purist. He had lost brothers in Fallujah and Ramadi, and he viewed the integration mandate as a political stunt that would inevitably get his men killed. "I don't care how well you shoot paper targets or play hide-and-seek in the snow, Chief," Stone had told her on her first day at Dam Neck, Virginia. "When the bullets start snapping, and you have to drag a 250-pound man out of a fatal funnel, I need to know you won't hesitate. Until you prove that, you are a liability. Keep your mouth shut, do your job, and don't expect me to hold your hand." Anna had simply nodded. "Understood, sir." She knew that words were wind. Only the mission mattered. 6 months later, the mission finally came. Red Squadron was deployed to Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. The Horn of Africa was a powder keg, and the United States was quietly fighting a shadow war against a highly organized syndicate of weapons traffickers, supplying heavily armed extremist factions across the Sahel. The heat in Djibouti was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on the corrugated metal roofs of the base. The air smelled of aviation fuel, dust, and stale sweat. Inside the Joint Operations Center, JOC, The air conditioning rattled violently, struggling to keep the banks of monitors and encrypted communication servers cool. Red Squadron had been tracking a phantom. His name was Tariq Al-Fayed, a former intelligence officer turned warlord who was responsible for moving anti-aircraft munitions across the Mali-Niger border. He was smart, heavily guarded, and notoriously paranoid. Human intelligence finally placed him at a remote, heavily fortified compound in the Ahaga Mountains, a desolate, rocky expanse of the Sahara. The objective was straightforward but brutal. A nighttime halo, high-altitude, low-opening insertion, a 5-mile overland foot patrol, a synchronized breach of the compound, the capture or kill of Al-Fayed, and immediate exfiltration via stealth Black Hawks. Anna was assigned as the primary overwatch. Her job was to scale a jagged ridgeline overlooking the compound, eliminate the perimeter sentries with suppressed fire, and provide a god's-eye view of the assault. Master Chief Miller, the man who had given her her call sign, would be her spotter. As the team geared up, checking weapons, adjusting plate carriers, and syncing their night vision panoramic goggles, the doors to the JOC swung open. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from focused tension to rigid formality. Admiral Richard Halsey had arrived. Admiral Halsey was a relic of a bygone era. He had made his name during the Gulf War, a surface fleet commander who had maneuvered his way into the upper echelons of Special Operations Command through sheer political ruthlessness. He was a broad-shouldered man with a perfectly pressed uniform, a face like weathered leather, and a deep-seated disdain for the modern, progressive military. He was in Djibouti on a tour, primarily to oversee the Al-Fayed raid and ensure he got a piece of the credit when it succeeded. Halsey walked through the JOC with an entourage of aides, his eyes sweeping over the operators of Red Squadron. Lieutenant Commander Stone stood at attention, outlining the final infiltration routes on a digital topographical map. "So this is the tip of the spear," Halsey boomed, his voice carrying an undeniable arrogance. "The much-feared Red Squadron." He paused, his gaze landing on Anna. She was kneeling by a Pelican case, meticulously applying desert camo tape to the scope of her Taki 50, a heavy anti-material rifle designed to punch through engine blocks at a mile out. Halsey's brow furrowed. He stepped away from the briefing table and walked over to her. The silence in the room thickened. Every operator stopped what they were doing. Miller, standing next to Anna, stiffened. "Well, well," Halsey said, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips. "I heard the rumors, but I didn't believe them. Washington actually forced a girl into my Tier 1 teams." Anna finished wrapping the tape, secured the edge, and stood up. She assumed the position of attention, her face a blank slate. "Chief Petty Officer Jennings, sir." Halsey looked her up and down, his smirk widening into a grin as he looked back at his aides, who offered sycophantic chuckles. "A female sniper, isn't that something? Tell me, Chief, what do the boys call you? What's your call sign? The Den Mother? Tinkerbell?" The insult hung in the air, thick and humiliating. Lieutenant Commander Stone's jaw tightened. He didn't like Anna being there, but she was his operator. An insult to her was an insult to Red Squadron. But before Stone could intervene, Anna looked directly into the Admiral's eyes. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just a terrifying glacial calm. "They call me Night Fox, sir," she said, her voice low and even. Halsey chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound that echoed through the JOC. "Night Fox. Very dramatic, Chief. Let's hope you don't get stage fright when the real men start kicking down doors. Don't shoot any of my boys in the back." "I don't miss, sir," Anna replied flatly. Halsey scoffed, turning his back on her. "We'll see. Wheels up in 2 hours, Stone. I want Al-Fayed's head on a platter by sunrise." 2 hours later, the ramp of the C-17 Globemaster opened into the pitch-black sky 30,000 feet above the Sahara Desert. The temperature outside was 50 degrees below zero. Anna stood at the edge of the ramp, breathing compressed oxygen, the heavy weight of her rucksack and her sniper system secured to her harness. The green light flashed. She stepped off into the void. For 2 minutes there were nothing but silent meteors falling through the blackness. At 4,000 feet, Anna pulled her ripcord. The canopy deployed with a violent snap, and she immediately checked her altimeter and compass. She steered her chute toward the designated rally point, a dry riverbed, or wadi, 3 miles from the target compound. The landing was brutal, the rocky terrain unforgiving, but within seconds she had her parachute buried and her weapon assembled. Around her, the silhouettes of Red Squadron materialized from the darkness. Comms check. Green across the board. Nightfox. Ghost. Miller whispered over the encrypted radio, using his own call sign. Let's move to the high ground. We have a mile to climb. Copy that, Ghost. Moving. Anna and Miller broke off from the main assault element, navigating the treacherous, loose shale of the Ahaga mountainside. It took them an hour of agonizing, silent climbing to reach the overwatch position, a narrow precipice that offered a commanding view of the compound below. Through the green phosphorus glow of her PVS-31 night vision goggles, the target looked like a fortress, mud brick walls reinforced with steel plates, a courtyard filled with technicals, pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns, and at least 15 armed sentries patrolling the perimeter. Anna went prone, settling her TAC-50 onto its bipod. She dialed in her scope, feeling the wind against her cheek. Distance to target 1, she whispered. Miller was beside her, his spotting scope locked on. 840 yards. Wind is cross left to right. 5 knots. Humidity is dead. Target acquired, Anna breathed. Her crosshairs settled on a sentry pacing the roof of the main building. Down in the valley, Lieutenant Commander Stone and the 12-man assault team were creeping through the dry brush, nearing the outer wall. Back in Djibouti, Admiral Halsey was sitting comfortably in the command chair, sipping a black coffee, watching the drone feed stream live onto the main screens. Assault element is in position, Stone's voice crackled over the net. Nightfox, clear the board. Sending, Anna said. She exhaled, pausing at the bottom of her breath, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy rifle bucked against her shoulder. A microsecond later, the sentry on the roof dropped like a marionette with cut strings. Impact, Miller confirmed. Shift right. Second sentry at the gate. Sending. Another suppressed boom. Another target down. Board is clear, Anna reported. Breach, breach, breach. Stone's team blew the outer gate with a specialized thermal charge. The steel melted, and the operators flooded into the courtyard, suppressed M4s raising softly in the dark. It was supposed to be a standard surgical strike, room by room, slow and methodical. But as Stone's lead man kicked open the door to the main target building, the entire night erupted in fire. It wasn't a standard compound, it was a kill box. Hidden heavy machine gun emplacements, DSKs, firing 12.7mm armor-piercing rounds, tore through the mud brick walls from 3 sides, crossfiring directly into the courtyard where Red Squadron was exposed. Ambush! Ambush! Stone screamed over the radio, the sound of deafening gunfire and exploding RPGs drowning his words. We are pinned down, taking heavy casualties. Man down! Man down! On the ridgeline, Anna watched in horror as tracer rounds lit up the valley like a fireworks display. Red Squadron was trapped in a fatal crossfire. The intel was wrong. Al-Fayed wasn't hiding here. He had baited them. Command, this is Red Actual. We need immediate close air support. We are being shredded, Stone yelled. In the JOC in Djibouti, Admiral Halsey dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the floor. The drone feed showed a massacre unfolding. The thermal blooms of incoming fire were overwhelming the tiny American force. "Where is the air support?" Halsey barked at the communications officer, his face pale. "Sir, the enemy is using advanced GPS and radio jamming. Our birds can't lock coordinates, and the fast movers are 20 minutes out." The officer panicked. "They're completely cut off." Down in the courtyard, 2 SEALs were bleeding out. Stone was firing blindly from behind a crumbling wall, his ammunition running low. "Night Fox!" Stone's voice broke over the localized squad radio, desperate and raw. "Take out those DSKs. Do it now or we all die." Anna peered through her scope. The enemy machine gun nests were heavily fortified behind steel plating, with only narrow firing slits. From her angle, the shot was mathematically impossible. The target area was less than 3 inches wide, at a distance of 900 yards, through heavy smoke, mirage from the explosions, and shifting crosswinds caused by the fire. "Ghost," Anna said, her voice terrifyingly steady. "Give me a wind read." Miller was sweating, his eye glued to the spotter scope. "Anna, it's a 0 visibility shot. You have crosswinds shifting from 5 to 15 knots in the valley. The thermal bloom is blinding the optics." "I didn't ask for the odds, David," she snapped, shifting her bolt and racking a fresh point, .50 caliber round into the chamber. "I asked for the wind." In the ops center, Admiral Halsey stared at the screen, the weight of his arrogance suddenly crashing down upon him. He had marched America's finest warriors into a trap, and there was absolutely nothing his rank, his power, or his brass could do to save them. The room was dead silent, save for the frantic static of the dying men. Up on the mountain, the night fox settled her breathing, slowing her heart rate until the chaos of the world faded into a singular, narrow tunnel of focus. The silence on the mountain was absolute, a stark contrast to the apocalyptic roar echoing from the valley below. Up here, in the thin, freezing air of the Ahaga Range, there was only the wind, the steady rhythm of David Miller's breathing, and the cold steel of the Macmillan TAC-50 pressed against Anna's cheek. Down in the kill box, Lieutenant Commander Stone and his men were dying. The drone feed in the Djibouti Joint Operations Center displayed their thermal signatures huddled behind a crumbling fountain, surrounded by the blossoming white-hot flares of incoming 12.7mm rounds. Admiral Richard Halsey gripped the edge of the command table, his knuckles bone-white. The smug arrogance that had defined his arrival was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, sinking terror of a commander watching his career and his men being eviscerated in high definition. "Time of flight is 1.4 seconds, Miller whispered, his eye locked onto the spotting scope. He was rapidly adjusting the data on his ballistic calculator. The variables were a nightmare. "You're shooting through a thermal wash. The heat from the explosions is creating a massive mirage effect over the courtyard. I can barely see the firing slit of the primary DSHK." "I see the muzzle flash," Anna replied, her voice dropping into the flat, detached register that always preceded violence. She wasn't looking at the building. She was looking at the rhythmic, pulsating strobe of the enemy's heavy machine gun. "Wind is full value left to right," Miller called out, reading the dust kicking up across the valley floor. "Call it 12 knots, gusting to 15. Dial elevation up 3.8 mils. Hold left 2.5 for windage." Anna made the micro-adjustments to her turrets with precise clicks. She shifted her reticle, aiming not at the target, but at an empty patch of dark mud brick 2.5 meters to the left and slightly above the firing slit. At 900 yards, she had to account for bullet drop, the push of the crosswind, the spin drift of the heavy .50 caliber bullet, and even the Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth beneath the projectile during its flight. "Send it," Miller breathed. Anna exhaled. At the very bottom of her breath, between the beats of her own heart, she applied exactly 4 pounds of pressure to the trigger. The TAC-50 roared, a deafening concussion that kicked up a cloud of shale dust around them. The massive 750-grain Raufoss Mark 211 armor-piercing incendiary round broke the sound barrier, tearing across the valley. In the JOC, Halsey and the brass watched the screen. For a torturous second and a half, nothing happened. Then, the primary machine gun nest on the drone feed simply detonated. The Raufoss round hadn't just passed through the narrow 3-inch slit. It had struck the heavy steel plating of the DSK itself, fragmenting and igniting the enemy's ammunition belt. The thermal camera flared blinding white as the nest blew outward, silencing the heaviest gun pinning down Red Squadron. "Target neutralized," the communications officer in Djibouti shouted, a crack of disbelief in his voice. "Good impact," Miller confirmed on the ridgeline, quickly racking the bolt back. The empty brass casing flew out, smoking in the cold air. "Shift right. Second nest. Elevation remains constant. Wind is dropping. Call it 10 knots. Hold left 2.0. "Acquired," Anna said, the fresh round chambering with a heavy metallic clack. Before she could take the shot, the enemy shifted tactics. Realizing their fortified nests were suddenly vulnerable to sniper fire, the second DSHK gunner slammed a heavy steel shutter over his firing slit, completely blind-firing through the mud wall to suppress Stone's position. "He's buttoned up!" Stone screamed over the radio, the panic roar. "We're taking fragmentation from the wall. I have 2 critical casualties. We need to move to the extraction point now." "Night Fox, he's behind 8 inches of reinforced mud, brick and steel plating," Miller warned. "You don't have a line of sight." "I don't need a line of sight," Anna replied. "I know where the gun is bolted. Give me the density estimate on that wall." Miller didn't hesitate. "Standard Sahel construction. Cured mud, rebar, maybe some scrap iron. Your AP rounds will penetrate, but deflection is a major risk. Aim center mass of the muzzle flash penetration." Anna tracked the erratic, pulsing light of the DSHK rounds tearing through the wall. She visualized the gunner's position behind the barrier, creating a geometric map in her mind. She held her breath, adjusted her crosshairs over the blank, solid wall, and squeezed. Boom! The bullet struck the wall with the force of a freight train. On the drone feed, Halsey watched a massive crater erupt on the exterior of the building. The Raufoss round punched entirely through the reinforced barrier, exploding on the inside of the room. The DSK ceased firing instantly. "Second nest down," Miller said, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Moving to exfil," Stone yelled. On the screen, the battered remnants of Red Squadron began to drag their wounded toward the blown outer gate. But the nightmare wasn't over. The trap had a secondary jaw. As Stone's men moved into the open desert toward the designated landing zone, a hidden cellar door in the courtyard burst open. 6 enemy fighters sprinted out, flanking the retreating SEALs. 2 of them hoisted RPG-7s onto their shoulders, aiming directly at the backs of the men carrying the wounded. "Movers in the courtyard! Flanking right!" Miller shouted. "They have rockets!" At that distance, a rocket-propelled grenade fired into the tight formation of SEALs would kill them all. "Distance," Anna demanded, her eye scanning frantically. 800! They're sprinting! Full sprint! Wind is chaotic in the courtyard, bouncing off the walls. I can't give you a clean read." It was an impossible shot. A moving target, at half a mile, through swirling smoke and unpredictable wind. Mathematical certainty was gone. All that was left was instinct. Anna found the lead RPG gunner in her scope. He was running laterally across her field of view, stopping to take a knee and aim at Stone. She didn't wait for Miller. She bypassed the calculator, relying entirely on the thousands of hours she had spent tracking moving game in the Montana backcountry. She swung the heavy barrel of the rifle, tracking ahead of the running man, estimating his speed, leading him by 3 full body lengths. As the fighter dropped to one knee and raised the rocket, Anna fired. The bullet crossed the valley. The fighter's finger tightened on the RPG trigger. But before the rocket could ignite, the .50 caliber round struck the warhead itself. The sympathetic detonation was spectacular. The high-explosive anti-tank rocket blew up in the fighter's face, a massive, concussive wave that instantly neutralized him and the 5 men sprinting behind him. The blast knocked Stone and his men to the dirt, but they were alive. "Clear," Anna whispered, her shoulder aching from the brutal recoil of the rapid shots. "The board is clear." In the JOC, there were no cheers. There was only a heavy, suffocating silence. Admiral Halsey stared at the monitors, watching the dust settle over the devastated compound. The extraction helicopters, finally breaking through the jamming frequency, swooped in on the thermals, loading the bleeding men of Red Squadron. Halsey slowly slumped back into his chair. He looked at the live feed from the ridgeline, where 2 tiny, cold white signatures were packing up their gear and fading back into the darkness. The flight back to Camp Lemonnier was a grim affair. The smell of copper blood, sweat, and burnt cordite filled the cramped cabin of the stealth Black Hawk. Stone sat near the open door, his uniform soaked in the blood of his point man, staring blankly at the desert rushing beneath them. Anna sat opposite him, her face completely obscured by the shadows, her heavy rifle resting between her boots. No one spoke. When the helicopters finally touched down on the tarmac in Djibouti, the sun was just beginning to crest over the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and bruised purple. Medical teams rushed the birds, immediately medevacing the 2 critical casualties to the base hospital. The remaining operators of Red Squadron, exhausted, battered, and coated in fine white sand, walked slowly toward the Joint Operations Center for the mandatory debrief. When the heavy blast doors of the JOC hissed open, the air conditioning hit them like a physical blow. The room was packed with intelligence officers, drone operators, and brass. At the center of it all stood Admiral Richard Halsey. He had spent the last 3 hours preparing for this moment. He had drafted speeches in his head about resilience, about the fog of war, about overcoming bad intelligence. He wanted to re-establish his dominance, to remind these bruised men that he was still the commander. But as Stone walked into the room, his eyes dead and hollow, the words died in Halsey's throat. Stone didn't salute. He didn't even look at the Admiral. He walked to the center of the room, dropped his helmet onto the briefing table with a loud clatter, and turned around. The rest of the squadron filed in behind him, forming a loose, intimidating wall of armed, bloodied men. Then, the ranks parted. Chief Petty Officer Anna Jennings walked through. Her face was smeared with dirt and camouflage grease, her eyes sunken with fatigue, but her posture was razor straight. She didn't look like an experiment anymore. She looked like the angel of death. She stopped in front of the table, directly across from Admiral Halsey. She did not salute. She merely stared at him, her glacial, detached gaze pinning him to the spot. The silence in the room was absolute. It wasn't the silence of respect for rank. It was the silence of a command that had just been forced to confront its own hubris. The aides who had chuckled at Halsey's joke just hours ago were now staring at their boots, terrified to make a sound. Halsey swallowed hard. The patronizing smirk was completely gone. He looked at the blood on Stone's gear, and then back to the woman who had single-handedly pulled them out of the fire. "Chief Jennings," Halsey started, his voice lacking its usual booming resonance. It sounded thin, fragile. Anna said nothing. Halsey cleared his throat, desperately trying to salvage some shred of dignity. The precision you displayed today. It was exceptional. You saved a lot of my boys out there. Anna finally blinked. She looked at Stone, then at the exhausted operators standing behind her, before bringing her gaze back to the Admiral. "They're my boys, sir," she said quietly. The words weren't delivered with venom or spite. They were delivered as an immovable, undeniable fact. Stone stepped forward, placing a heavy, blood-stained hand on Anna's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but in the tight-knit world of Tier 1 operators, it was a profound declaration. The purest commander, the man who had told her she was a liability, was publicly claiming her as his own. "Debrief is concluded," Stone said, his voice raspy. He didn't ask for permission. He looked directly at Halsey. "My team is standing down." Without waiting for a dismissal, Stone turned and walked out of the JOC. One by one, the operators of Red Squadron followed him. Anna picked up her heavy Pelican case, turned her back on the Admiral, and walked out into the rising African sun. Halsey stood alone at the table, surrounded by his silent staff. He looked at the empty doorway, the phantom echo of his earlier joke ringing in his ears. He realized then that he had walked into that room a commander. But he was leaving it as a relic. He never asked for another call sign. He never questioned the integration mandate again. The files on the Djibouti operation were highly classified, heavily redacted, and buried in the Pentagon's archives. The official narrative would claim that close air support had neutralized the ambush. But within the shadowy halls of naval special warfare, the truth propagated like wildfire. They spoke of the Ahaga Mountains. They spoke of the impossible shots through smoke and steel. And they spoke of the woman who had looked the brass in the eye and commanded the silence of the room. The military establishment demands conformity, yet it is the outliers who salvage its darkest hours. Chief Jennings didn't just save Red Squadron that night. She shattered a glass ceiling with armor-piercing precision. Admiral Halsey never asked for another call sign. He learned, in the heavy silence of a shocked command center, that true lethal capability wears no specific face. It simply waits in the dark, ready to strike.